أهلا بكم مشاهدينا الكرام إلى حلقة جديدة من مستقبل الطاقة. هذه ملفاتنا. هل قلق أسواق النفط حيال الطلب في محله؟ توقعات بعودة برنت إلى $90 بعيد نهاية الصيف. يساور القلق البعض في أسواق النفط حيال قوة الطلب العالمي، خاصة قبيل موسم الصيف ومع انطلاقة موسم قيادة السيارات. وقد تجلت هذه التخوفات في أسعار النفط التي فقدت مستوى $90 منتصف إبريل الماضي. وبالفعل برزت بعض مكامن الضعف في السوق النفطية، لا سيما في منتجات التقطير المتوسطة الميدل ديستلتس مثل وقود الديزل وزيوت التدفئة، والتي شهدت ضعفا في الطلب في الأشهر القليلة الأخيرة. لكن السبب في ذلك يعود إلى دفء موسم الشتاء الأخير عموما أكثر من كونه انعكاسا لتباطؤ اقتصادي. إلا أنه وفي المقابل شهدت الأسواق مكامن قوة تركزت تحديدا في كميات الطلب على البنزين، فبالرغم من تحذيرات وكالة الطاقة الدولية قبل نحو العام بأن استهلاك البنزين بلغ ذروته عام 2019 وبأنه لن يعود أبدا إلى سابق عهده بسبب نمو مبيعات السيارات الكهربائية، نعرف اليوم بأن الطلب على البنزين العام الماضي سجل مستوى قياسيا جديدا، وأنه مستمر بالنمو هذه السنة أيضا، حيث يتم اليوم إعادة تقييم وخفض للنمو المتوقع المبالغ به في انتشار وتبني السيارات الكهربائية، خاصة في الوقت الذي وصلت فيه أعداد سيارات محرك الاحتراق الداخلي عالميا إلى مستويات قياسية. مكمن نمو آخر في السوق النفطية يعود إلى الطلب على وقود الطائرات في ظل التعافي الكامل للطيران من آثار الجائحة، خاصة الرحلات الدولية. ففي شهر مايو ارتفع عدد الرحلات عالميا عن نفس مستواها قبل الجائحة بنحو 5%، في حين وهذا الأهم لربما ارتفعت المسافات الجوية التي تقطعها الرحلات عالميا بنحو 10% مقارنة بنفس الفترة قبل الجائحة. وبالتالي عندما نجمع هذه الأجزاء المختلفة تتضح لنا الصورة أكثر، وهي صورة تؤكد لنا على أن الطلب العالمي على النفط ما زال في صحة جيدة، وبأنه سيسجل نموا هذا العام سيكون على الأغلب أقرب إلى توقعات أرامكو البالغة 1.5 مليون برميل يوميا من توقعات وكالة الطاقة الدولية البالغة 1,100,000 برميل يوميا. بالتالي إذا كان لابد من شيء من أن يؤرق أسواق النفط فهو ليس ضعف الطلب، بل الخطر الأكبر على الأغلب هو قوة نمو إنتاج النفط من خارج أوبك بلس. إلى جانب أهمية قوة نمو الطلب العالمي هذا العام على موازين سوق النفط خلال النصف الثاني من السنة، إلا أن تلك الموازين ستعتمد بشكل كبير على قرار تحالف أوبك بلس وكبار منتجيه في اجتماع يونيو المقبل. فماذا ستفعل أوبك بلس؟ وما هي توقعات نمو الطلب تحديدا في الصين؟ وفي ضوء تباطؤ مبيعات السيارات الكهربائية في الدول الغربية مؤخرا، ما هو مستقبل تبني تلك المركبات على المدى الأطول؟ هذه المواضيع وغيرها تناولناها في هذه المقابلة الموسعة مع رئيس الأساسيات في Energy Aspects سامر موسس. لنتابع.
I think you're asking one of the most important questions right now is what OPEC is going to do. And look, just like the rest of the market, OPEC wants to see sustained, real draws in global inventories before it takes any action. It's not going to take action in anticipation of those draws. It's going to take action once it sees them and verifies them. And that puts us in a position right now where OPEC is going into a meeting and we haven't seen the draws of large volume yet. And thus it's not ready to make a choice to release that grip that you're talking about, although we wouldn't call it a grip. We just said they're balancing the market.
Well, let's discuss the global oil inventories, which are set to register a decline in the first half. The EIA, for example, expects a draw of around 300,000 barrels per day. Supposing OPEC Plus does extend its cuts into the second half, how do you see inventories faring in the next 6 months?
Absolutely. So first off, we'll start by saying that Energy Aspects looks at balances very closely and from a high frequency perspective. And we use some technology such as nowcasting to try to get as close to the truth as possible. And we actually see that, it's not as much of a draw as we've seen the EISA or build, and it's more of a flatter situation at the moment. The real story is what's going to be coming in the next quarter and into late summer. I think as it stands, EA, Energy Aspects, and the market consensus really is that we start to see draws from balances in late summer, Q3 to the end of the year. Now, we think that that is expectation, but if OPEC were to further keep their cuts in place, those draws would be even larger. And in that sense, we think there would need to be some kind of balancing mechanism. And for us, that would be refining runs. So you'd see that the profitability of products, given the crude price, would margins would move in the wrong direction, and thus you would end up having, stock draws, but you'd have smaller refined product builds. And I think that's how the market finds itself in balance if OPEC is not to extend. If OPEC is to extend its cuts.
Well, Samer, let's discuss those upcoming summer months, because even if OPEC Plus extends current levels into the second half, some predict a tighter summer market given the driving season on the demand side and given the summer oil burn in the Middle East on the supply side. So how high can we actually see oil prices in the next couple of months, and what's your Brent price expectations for year end?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, when we look to the balance of the year and we think about OPEC kind of maintaining its current posture, which we think in all likelihood they will maintain to the end of the year, we don't think that this coming meeting they're going to come out and say we're holding through the end of the year. We think instead it's most likely that we will see an announcement for the next couple of months come in June, and then another announcement a few months after that, so that OPEC can continue to take stock of what's going on. Now, let's just assume that we see a rollover of the cuts through the end of the year. In that scenario, we think that it's likely and possible that we see oil prices touch recent highs we've seen in the last year. Now, we're not talking about triple digits, but we are talking about hitting some of those peaks that we saw in January and February. And that's kind of the direction of price action that we expect. And this is all on a background of strong demand in China, as well as lackluster demand in Europe. And I'm sure we'll get into those topics.
Yeah, specifically on China, I would like to get your views on that. But before that, when it comes to oil demand, where do you see the bright spots and the pockets of weaknesses geographically and product-wise in the second half?
I think, seasonally, of course, we see transportation fuels picking up. But I think one of the key things we need to keep in mind is that there's just no growth in Europe. And all the growth we see is in non-OECD countries, Asian countries. And so we're talking a lot about Chinese demand growth, where we see some expansion in transportation fuels, about 100,000 barrels a day. But really the driver there is around petchem demand, and then this is petchem production, going further down the molecule, the carbon molecule, to refine further, and we're talking naphtha type products in the petchem sector, and this is where we see a lot of demand materializing for crude as we move through the year.
EV adoption rates have slowed down in the US and Europe, so are the EV transition targets increasingly out of reach, out of touch?
That's a good question. So I think we should rephrase the question and think about where on the cost curve, where in the evolutionary cycle is EV adoption? Has it slowed in Western countries, in the U.S. specifically, in the last couple of months? Yes, adoption has slowed. But has it stopped? No, it hasn't stopped. Every kind of new technology goes through these phases where you have an initial fast pickup and you have some slowing. We think that we are in this kind of maturation phase. We've got to keep in mind that the trends are different regionally as well. Where in the U.S., absolutely, there has been in the last couple of months this concern about cost and ability to sell or meet customer needs. This extends to Europe as well. But in that side of the world, you'll start to see policy push these EVs into the market. You're going to have requirements for environmental sales targets for these companies to be met through selling EVs. So there's going to be a need for some of these European countries. It's going to cause some supply push. Now, if we look at Asia, it's a bit different story. EV pickup there, is much broader than we've seen here, and it's also priced differently, where in the US and Europe, a lot of these EVs are premium vehicles. In Asia, there are entry-level EVs, and those are making their way into other markets. So when we think about the path for EVs, we think that by 2035, 50% of new car sales will be EVs. That's lower than the IEA's many of their scenarios, and it's a view that we've held for some time now, and we think it's a realistic one.
Well, let's zoom in on China now. Could demand there, Samer, still be the wild card for this year? I mean, growth forecasts for China for oil demand varies by some 500,000 barrels a day. Some say oil demand is now detached from GDP growth over there. Others say that slower GDP growth, declining population, less construction activity, slower demand for Chinese industrial products abroad, all of these factors will eventually lead to slower oil demand in China. Even CNPC expects a timid growth of less than 200,000 barrels per day this year. So what is your house view, and what are the dynamics at play here?
Look, we got to first think about terms. I mean, I think there's a lot of terminology going around about decoupling, and we don't see decoupling per se. We still see a lot of growth in China. In fact, our growth estimates are about 4.8% GDP growth year on year. Now, that is lower than last year's 5.2%, and it's lower than the 5% target. But 4.8% is nothing to sneeze at. So we still see some growth there. And I think you are right to point out that, historically, when China analysis has often looked at it from a super macro perspective, and it's time to get really at the sectoral level and see how different sectors are doing. I think that's going to be how analysis of where growth it will be found is going to mature as we move forward. Now, we do think this year a lot of the growth is contingent on strong fiscal support. We've already seen that, right? We're kind of seeing it in new instances of it repeatedly, and the market's watching very closely for that. And then that feeds into sectors like you say, construction and manufacturing. We do see net demand growth in China this year, around 400,000 barrels a day. Now that's partially some pickup in transport fuels, jet fuel, gas and gasoline. We'll see some decline in other fuels like diesel, but on net, especially given this drive into petrochemicals, we do see growth in China. But as you say, it's one of the biggest wild cards. The other big wild card is the U.S. What are we going to see out of U.S. production? And that's, these are two different sides of the market, and they're equally important to how everything shapes up.
نتوقف مع فاصل قصير نتابع بعده في مستقبل الطاقة. بعد نمو مفاجئ بمليون برميل يوميا العام الماضي، الإنتاج الأمريكي من النفط هذا العام يواجه عائق البنى التحتية. أهلا بكم من جديد مشاهدينا الكرام. السباق الرئاسي الأمريكي سيكون له تبعات على سياسة الطاقة، إلا أن آثاره برأي ضيفنا سامر موسس من Energy Aspect ستكون أكبر على الصعيد الدولي أكثر منه على الصعيد الداخلي الأمريكي. لكننا في الجزء الثاني من المقابلة بدأنا من الإنتاج النفطي الأمريكي، فبعد نموه القوي بمليون برميل يوميا العام الماضي ليصل إلى مستوى قياسي جديد، ما مدى التباطؤ المحتمل هذا العام؟ لنتابع.
Up until recently, I was working in the U.S. and U.S. government, and we watched these numbers very closely. And I can say that, when you hit that 13.3 million barrel a day target, that is something we noticed working at the White House. It was not a nothing number, and we've seen the return to that number kind of slower than some expected because of freeze-offs and other issues. But we think that it's a growth story this year, and it really comes down to infrastructure. If we think about where the core growth is, the Permian, one of the biggest constraints we've had there this year or in the last, the last 6 months or so has been the ability to move byproducts of crude out of the market because of regulation, because of environmental concerns, flaring of byproducts like natural gas from associated gas production plays is, not okay, not something that many companies will do. And accordingly, you need that pipeline takeaway capacity. And we've seen constraints there in the Permian, and that's really held back crude production. But if you look forward just a couple months, we see some new projects coming online, pipeline takeaway project that is, specifically the Matterhorn, which will increase the ability to move natural gas out of the Permian, and that will deconstrain, if you will, some of the U.S. production. And that will help us grow. Now, this is kind of also going to be augmented by some Gulf of Mexico production growth, where we see a number of projects adding a smaller amount. So year to year, year enter to exit, we see about 400,000 barrels a day of growth. That's not the same we saw last year, but it's also not nothing. And that's something that the market's going to be watching closely because of a lot of the variability we've seen in company structure and company capital discipline decision-making. But what we see as the biggest variable, one of the biggest variables to watch, at least in the next couple of months, is going to be that infrastructure-driven growth. Yeah.
Despite significant geopolitical events in the first half, oil price volatility has been relatively subdued. Do you expect this to continue in this way? And is the reason for this reduced volatility the significant spare capacity at OPEC Plus, which some put it at around 5 million barrels per day currently?
I mean, look, if as an analyst for many years now, if you would have told me that we had two wars, one in mainland Europe and one in the Middle East, and we had a major waterway getting bombed, I would tell you you're going to have triple-digit oil at the least. And we're just not in that scenario. The market has gotten accustomed to geopolitical risk in a way that most didn't expect. I think we're in a world now where these geopolitical concerns are no longer shaking the market. They're no longer scaring the market. What we have seen, even in the biggest spike driven by geopolitics, we've seen, which was due to a Houthi attack, we've seen a very quick calming down of markets. And this calming down is really important. One of the things that we're proud of doing at Energy Aspects is really diving into quant analytics and taking a look at some of the trading activity that's being done in financial markets. And what we have found is that there is significant paper, financial, if you will, non-physical trade, if you will, that dampens the volatility from these instances and kind of keeps a tight range around where you see the trade go when these geopolitical events happen. Right now, when the market is kind of waiting to see significant draws in Q3, it's kind of a wait and see moment. And in this position, we do expect prices to stay in a quite tight band. And that is, to a degree, aided by the activity of these CTAs, if you will, these paper algorithmic traders.
Well, staying on the political note here, how can the U.S. presidential elections and the run-up to it and at its finish line affect energy markets and the more wider energy transition narrative this year and moving into next?
Look, that's the million-dollar question. The election is the million-dollar question. But I don't think it is in the way that most people would anticipate. Let's talk about it domestically first and then internationally. I actually think domestically, if we think about one of the biggest energy-related achievements of the Biden administration, aside from using the FPR in a very strategic way, put that to the side, has been the Inflation Reduction Act. And the reality is we don't think that even if Trump won, there would be a major rollback of that Inflation Reduction Act. Why? Why, given it's a flagship Biden achievement? Well, it's because many of the states that have benefited the most are actually Republican states. So the biggest domestic change in environmental support from the government, this Biden move, we don't see big changes there. There will be headlines of people trying to pick at the corners of the policy, but fundamentally, we don't see a change there. Now, where we do see a change domestically is potentially on methane regulation, there's some activity you could see there, but in reality, as we spoke about earlier, these major companies, these major vertically integrated oil companies have already committed to stop flaring, have already committed methane mitigation. So we don't, the policy is not going to be the major driver there. Where we do, though, think it's really important who wins is in foreign policy. Let's take sanctions, for example. There's a lot of sanctions activity we have seen in the last couple of years. Now, we don't think that there would be a rollback of any sanctions if the administration were to flip, but the tone and tempo and focus of those sanctions could change if the administration were to flip. At the same time, you'd see a big shift in the commitments to things like the Paris Agreement, and you'd see a big shift in our international drive, the U.S.'s current international drive to kind of put forth environmental actions. So the elections do matter. Now, in the interim, in the medium term, until we get to elections, which you've asked about, and I think it's an important time horizon, the biggest thing is about price stability. The biggest thing is about taking action to ensure that American consumers are getting the best value, the best deal they can. And that is, what we see the administration doing. They're taking a number of actions like, extending, changing the ethanol requirements for gasoline, putting, potentially gasoline tax breaks. I think these kind of actions are really important to make sure the American consumer is not seeing too large of an increase in their gasoline bill. Which, remember, we're in this period where CPI is a huge concern, and overall inflation is a huge concern. So it's in the microscope for sure.
بهذا مشاهدينا نصل إلى ختام هذه الحلقة من مستقبل الطاقة. دائما تابعونا على منصة إكس تحت هاشتاغ مستقبل الطاقة، ويمكنكم مشاهدة كامل حلقات البرنامج على موقعنا الإلكتروني وأيضا على قناة العربية على يوتيوب. إلى اللقاء.